The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
So I firmly believe that hope is a muscle. So it's a thing that we flex, and it's a thing that we exercise. And I think even though a lot of these poems are dark, the spaces in between are light. So it takes hope every time you get knocked down to stand back up again, or to believe that there's good at the end.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Dawn E. Morrow writes poems for people who believe they don't like poetry. Her debut collection is called The Habit of Hope. Here's what the poet Lucy Shaw had to say about Dawn. When a poet like Dawn Morrow arrives in the landscape of poetry, I am deeply grateful. Reading her fresh, vital writing, I want to celebrate the knowing craftsmanship that underlines the poems and her attention to detail. I was glad for a few minutes to sit down with Dawn Morrow. Dawn Morrow, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today.
I'm great. I can't wait.
So your collection of poetry, The Habit of Hope, just released. And I'm so excited that I have seen some of these poems through the years, and just I'm so excited to see them all in one place. So congratulations. I'm proud of you. And let's talk about it.
Great.
Tell me about your writing journey, how you got to this point to where you are,
Absolutely. Yes.
publishing collections of poetry.
That's right. Who would have guessed? I have been writing since I was tiny little. So some of my first memories are dragging this old manual typewriter into the middle of my living room and plucking out stories on it.
Uh-huh.
I kind of continued that storyteller thing all the way through elementary school, wrote for contests, all those things you do in elementary school. I wrote my first essays in high school, and for a while I thought I was an essayist.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point I was playing with magnetic poetry on my fridge, and I put together this little poem because magnetic poetry forced me to put words together that I wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah.
I posted it anonymously on a message board, and a guy named Aaron Tate, who was a songwriter, saw it and asked to publish it in the little journal the band did every year. So that was my first foray into poetry. I thought I hated poetry. At that point, I didn't know any poets that I liked. I only knew things like The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, and the kind of poetry that is complex and confusing that they introduce you to in high school. Until about 2013, when I was sitting under a tent listening to you and Andrew Peterson talk about writing concretely at Hutchmoot.
Yeah.
And one of you, and I think it was Andrew, read a poem by Jeannie Murray Walker called Adam's Choice. And for the first time, I heard my own voice in a poem. And I was like, oh, I could write that. That's a thing I could write. And from there, I read everything that she wrote. And then about a year and a half later, I went to Alaska with Jeannie Murray Walker and Lucy Shaw, where we spent a week writing poems and critiquing poems. And I just completely fell in love.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I moved into grad school and started writing in earnest and practicing the craft of poetry. So I never would have described myself as a poet until around that time.
Yeah. And then that was, you say grad school, that was an MFA program at Seattle Pacific.
That's correct. I did a low residency MFA at Seattle Pacific. So we would work by ourselves at home for 12 weeks and then fly out twice a year for residencies for face-to-face time. So I've studied under two poets who were critical in kind of shaping my abilities.
Who were those two poets?
Jeannie Murray Walker was one of them. She's the one that sucked me right into that program. And then Robert Cording, who lives up in Connecticut. He is primarily a nature poem or a nature poet.
Nature poet, yeah.
Yes.
And your work, what you do 40 hours a week is pretty different from poetry.
It is
sort of a bureaucratic job.
Yeah, I work for the FBI. And I actually run all of their medical systems right now. So it's completely different.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I loved what, I love that you got a blurb from Lucy Shaw. And then I love what Lucy Shaw said. She says, I love it when a poem begins with a statement of fact that evolves like a bud opening into flower so that the image is more than the sum of its parts. And then she goes on to say that that's the way your poetry feels, which good on you. But that made me think of your poem, Moonflowers. Would you be willing to read Moonflowers? And let's talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. The Moonflowers. When summer sun dropped low enough to cast our shadows long and lean, we gathered in the neighbor's yard, waiting for the moonflowers to bloom. Pavement hot against bare feet, we jumped from sidewalk onto grass, cooling our souls, rough from days of running free. Our parents drank from plastic cups of boxed red wine or bud. Summer by summer, our number dwindled, divorce and aging taking their toll. Still, every evening we watched until the little flowers quivered, loosening their buds, and the first flower shook its petals free. One by one, they popped open until an entire bouquet of white trumpets heralded their own arrival, as if announcing sometimes beauty comes at night.
I love it. And that poem, to me, that poem feels so central to the whole collection, right? This memory of, well, sort of a suburban childhood that's haunted by sadness and loss. I mean, that idea that every summer the group dwindled because of divorce and because of aging, and yet there's still some beauty. You're still showing up for the beauty. I think that's so good. Tell me, the floor is open to I just love this poem so much. I just wanted to get your additional thoughts on that poem.
Yeah, I think this memory, I think, is so core to my childhood. I lived in a small neighborhood in a small town where everybody knew each other. And if you did something wrong, your parents knew in about 7 seconds.
Yeah.
In this neighborhood in particular, we gathered frequently. So there were backyard parties. We had a volleyball and badminton nets up in our backyard. So we were a frequent gathering place. We actually put gates in the fences between the backyard so we could move from yard to yard. And I only remember this happening really kind of a few years out of all the years we lived there. And for some reason, I don't know how it happened, we would all kind of wander over as the dusk settled over the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And we would watch, and there were 2 8-year-olds that year, me and one of my best friends, and we would get real close to the flowers, and we would be the ones to call out when they were about to bloom because everybody else was wandering around chatting.
Yeah.
And that was such a poignant moment, I think, for the neighborhood to kind of watch these little flowers, and that set the rhythm of our summers.
And moonflowers, you can actually watch them pop out.
You can.
Yeah.
You can.
Yeah.
I don't think there are any other flowers like that, but they do exactly what I wrote. They quiver a little bit, and then the green pistils kind of the leaves kind of open before the bud pops.
Yeah. Well, I love that last line. Sometimes beauty comes at night. The title of your collection is The Habit of Hope. And there's a lot of sadness and grief and loss in these poems. It feels like you're working through a lot of loss from a father leaving to a mother dying, and a marriage that falls apart, and yet you call it The Habit of Hope. Tell me about that.
I do. So I firmly believe that hope is a muscle. So it's a thing that we flex, and it's a thing that we exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even though a lot of these poems are dark, the spaces in between are light. So it takes hope every time you get knocked down to stand back up again.
Yeah.
Or to believe that there's good at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll see in my collection, there are kind of these windows into that, like this poem, that kind of say it's not always dark.
Yeah.
Sometimes beauty comes at night. Sometimes the doctor calls back with good news. Sometimes you find love when you're not looking for it. So I think those kind of liminal spaces in between the poems invites the reader to keep hoping with the speaker of the poems.
What you said, the liminal spaces between the poems, you mean the white part of the page?
Yes, the white part of the page, spaces in between ending one poem and beginning the next, kind of those pauses in between.
Yeah.
I think are thresholds into asking the question, does it get better? How does it get better? How do you keep going?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all of that is the practice of the habit of hope.
Yeah. You mentioned that one thing that set you on your writing journey was coming to terms with the concrete, right? And I do think, as much as I'm learning to love the wasteland and so much of T.S. Eliot's poems. I have a reputation for disliking T.S. Eliot's poems, but the truth is, the more I read them, the more I like them. And yet, as you said, there's something abstract and very idea driven about what poets of his era did. And although I'm also, the more I look at Eliot, the more I realize there's a lot of concrete in there too.
Yeah.
I mean,
his imagery is super concrete.
Yeah, right. And so, but anyway, all that to say, I'd like to hear more about, well, it's like Lucy Shaw said, you approach these poems as we start with a concrete image and then let it unfold from there. Is that a fair assessment of how you do this?
I think so. I love quirky little facts. So somewhere in a poem that never quite got born is an idea that I heard on NPR that when a caterpillar changes to a butterfly, it actually turns into goop first.
Yeah.
Like its whole body falls apart. That poem wasn't quite ready to be written, but I love those weird little facts.
Yeah.
And these show up in my book pretty consistently. The other thing I think that helps do is I really like to write poems for people who don't like poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm writing for my 10th grade self.
Mm-hmm.
I'm writing for my boss at the FBI who used to say, send me a poem. I think poetry should be accessible. And I think we've moved away from that in our culture, in our country, into like, you need a key to unlock poetry. And I just don't think that's true. So I try to write my poems in a way that people can understand it on multiple levels. And I think as a poet, a lot of times you're writing about one thing. And then when I hear somebody read or reflect on a poem, I was like, that is not actually what I meant to write. And for whatever reason, that's how it's working itself out. So I think there's an idea that poems are living things for the reader. I think more than any other genre, what the reader brings to the text is really going to influence what they leave with it. So I think I start a lot of my poems very concretely because it gives the reader an in.
Yeah.
I want them to be familiar with what I'm writing about. Everybody has childhood memories of a garden. So yeah, I really want my poetry to be hospitable.
Yeah, I love it. And I think, as you were talking, and it occurs to me that one thing that concrete imagery does, and the economy of these little short poems, almost all of your poems fit on one page. Yep. And when you resist the temptation to say, to explain, to say, here's what all this means, the concrete image, as you said, it's hospitable insofar as it allows a reader to, as you said, the reader brings what the reader brings to the poem, and a tomato on a vine, that concrete image, we all have our own meaning that concrete image contains. I'm for some reason I'm losing track here. Help me out. You're the poet. You said you started out your writing life as an essayist, and the job of an essayist is to explain in some ways, right? And I love essays, and I love to hear the way one person's going to explain something to me. And then in that explanation, I often go straight into reaction mode, right? You've explained it this way, or you've made this argument, therefore now we're in an argument. And which is, again, I like that. But these kind of poems that you're doing here are different, right? You're saying, check out this tomato.
Yes.
and you do end up, offering your ideas about what this tomato means. I now can't remember the name of the poem, but there's a really lovely poem.
There's a couple tomato poems in there.
Yeah. And but again, the way Lucy Shaw put it is, you start with the image, and yes, you do get around to sort of interpreting that tomato for me, but first you give me the tomato, and I bring my own ideas about tomatoes to that.
Yeah. I think when I think about writing, if I want to convince you of something, I'm going to write an essay, because essays argue with your head. The first book we read when I was in the program at SPU is a book by Carl Dennis called Poetry is Persuasion. It sets out an argument that poems still are making an argument, but I would say poetry argues with your soul. It argues with your heart.
Yeah.
So when I'm putting forth a tomato and explaining to you, like, I had a bumper crop, and maybe that's all I'll ever have, but I did have a bumper crop at one point.
Yeah.
There's going to be something that resonates in your emotional core. And I don't think essays do that. I think that's why I kind of got away from essays. I still write essays sometimes. But I feel like, for me, I'd rather work at that soul kind of heart level. than the head. And also, frankly, I don't have a lot of patience, so it takes a lot more time to write an essay. Like I can write a poem in a sitting if I've thought about it for a while. So some of it's just the way I'm wired. But I think poetry makes us have to reflect. So when you're reading a poem, you're not building a counter argument. You're letting the poem seep in to kind of who you are.
Yeah. I love essays because you said they work at your head. I've got a head, and I like to have my head engaged, right?
Yes.
And so I think we can admire both of these forms without denigrating the other.
Yeah, they have different purposes.
Yeah,
and I think we need them both, just like we also need story, novel, narrative.
Yeah. Do you? Okay, I'm putting you on the spot now. And if we need to, if you can't come up with an example, we can cut this out. But what is a poem that has sort of argued with your heart or with your soul, that has changed the way you think about something?
I don't know if it's changed the way I thought about something, but it definitely kind of let me put things I had thought more into words. There's a poem by Ada Limon called How to Triumph Like a Girl.
Okay.
And she is a Kentucky poet. She's now our poet laureate.
Okay.
And she is looking at a racetrack, and she's talking about the lady horses. And her first line of the poem is, "I like the lady horses best." And she talks about how they run kind of differently than the male horses. And then she brings it back to herself and says, "I like to think that if you lifted my shirt, you would see a horse-sized heart beating within me."
Yeah.
And I feel like it had kind of brought together a lot of things I've been thinking about being a woman, about Ada Limon also does not have any children. So she writes from that perspective. So I think I clearly remember when I was reading that poem, it jumped up on my Twitter feed or my Insta feed, and I was captured immediately. Like, that first line is brilliant.
Yeah, I know. That's great. Say it again.
I like the lady horses best is her first line.
That is so good. Well, speaking of, you have a poem called Headstrong, which I didn't warn you about. And I immediately, when you started talking about the lady horses poem, I went straight to your Headstrong poem. And I'm going to read part of your poem back to you. How about that?
That's great.
I love what you do with the wordplay here. Bullheaded. So the poem starts out talking about somebody describes you as headstrong, and you say, is this bossy? Is this emotional? What does that mean? And then you end with this image. Bullheaded was the word my babysitter used when I refused to yield. I pictured great horns butting just above my ears, the kids around me falling silent, awed by my emerging strength. I love that so much. And I love the way you flip that. Bullheaded is a, not a positive descriptor of somebody, and you own it. And I love it.
I love that little poem because it was so true. I was walking to work with my buddy, and we joke now that he's my only coworker that has a poem in the book. It's not particularly attractive for him.
Yeah, right.
But he said something about me being headstrong, and I stopped walking in the streets of Washington, D.C., and I looked at him and I said, "I can't help but wonder if you would call me headstrong if I were a man."
Yeah.
And he also stopped and he thought about it, and he was like, I think I would. So that really opened up a conversation between us.
Yeah.
On kind of how we describe men and women using words that can be loaded sometimes on both sides. So that little poem kind of got born.
Yeah.
On the corner of Washington, D.C.
Well, I'm glad it got born. It's so good. And I love, again, that idea of, I think I will, speaking of a poem that that sort of changes the way you see things. I think I will henceforth, when I hear the word bullheaded, think about that little girl who imagines the horn sprouting and everybody being in awe. It's so good. I love it. Okay, I'm gonna float something that I want to hear you talk about. So good luck with this question. Before we started recording, you were talking about the idea that you think systematically. We weren't talking about poetry; we were talking about other areas of life, and that you think in systems. So, when it comes to solving problems, you can jump in and solve a little problem, or you can back up and think, what's the bigger systemic problem, and how do I help solve that? And I'm curious to know if that kind of systemic problem solving, or thinking about problems as systems, has impacted the way you write.
I really think it does. And I think the way it plays out in my writing is, as I move through the world, I kind of pick up little bits and pieces and stick them in my pocket for later. And then I put them all together like a puzzle. So you'll see very disparate images in my poems kind of come together. So you'll see a story about kind of going home and finding place by finding the shadow of an old fish pond that I used to go drop bread in with my grandmother. And then the next image is the dredge down at the beach. And those are such disparate images. Like, one is the beginning images are very homey. They're very grounded. They're very kind of familiar. And then the dredge out on the beach is this kind of industrial image. So I feel like that some of that systems thinking is pulling all of those pieces that look like they don't fit together into one poem. So we move in another poem from like tomatoes to hearts. And I'm always looking for those threads. I don't even know necessarily that I've collected them until I sit down to write. Yeah.
And also, again, to return to this idea of unfold, to start with an image and unfold, it feels like some of these images, you're seeing how they fit into a system, right?
Yes.
The temptation is to, temptation, that's too negative, but one way to approach this is to really zero in on the image, and another is just to back up a little bit and say, how does this image fit into a larger system of meaning, which is, that's what metaphor is, right? It's acknowledging that these things that we see in the world fit into something. The similarities between things, disparate things, exist because we observe them. We don't make metaphors. We observe metaphors because they all participate in the same system of meaning, and so they rhyme with one another.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think my poems always zoom out. There are a lot of poets who do the opposite. And I think that's one of the things that made me not connect with poetry like that. Elizabeth Bishop is an observer, and she observes these crazy minute little details. And when I read her work, I'm like, that is not, I can't do this. Like, she is not a poet. I love her work, but she does not resonate with me in the same way an Ada Limon does. And I think Limon does the same thing, where she pulls back and looks at the world more and more broadly.
Yeah. No, I love that you are thinking about what you can do and what you can't. I'm not saying you can't do what Elizabeth Bishop does, but it's helpful to know, here's what I do, and lean into that. Here's my patch of ground. And I'm glad we got Elizabeth Bishop over here doing this, but Dawn's doing this.
Yeah, that is not, that kind of detailed observation is not my native tongue. And I think I tell people when they read poetry to look for those Ada Limons that are going to kind of resonate with you. The poets where you think, or the writing, I think in general, where you think, oh, I could do that. Those are the poets that have a similar voice, or the writers that have a similar voice. And when I'm talking to people about writing, that's one of the things I say is pay attention to that. You're reading it and you think, oh, I could do that. Like that's something, that's a flair. So pay attention there, because that's the thing that's going to teach you most about kind of how you write.
Yeah.
The things you want to write about.
I should think that doing an MFA program would help with that, because you have to read so much.
Yeah, I did. That's where I found A.D. Limon. It's where I found most of my favorite poets. Tony Hoagland taught me a ton about wordplay, which he is a master and I am not, but he definitely taught me about that. Robert Pinsky is a master of kind of meter and rhythm, which I was very weak in. I read a ton of his work. So I think forcing yourself out of the things you just kind of read naturally is super helpful in picking up those little pieces. Yeah.
Earlier this week, I recorded a conversation with Drew Bratcher. And this, I'm not sure if this episode is going to be a week. That doesn't matter. I think that episode will have already aired by the time yours does. And but I got on the subject with him. I got on the subject of the MFA program because so I'd like to hear your reflections on. I mean, I've acknowledged this because I don't usually talk about MFA programs, and here we are, twice in 1 week. So tell me about. I get the impression you're really glad you did the MFA, and tell me about, because sometimes people ask me about MFAs. I never know what to say. So give us the case for what why it's a good thing or why it's not, what it's good for and what it's not good for.
Absolutely, because I don't think MFAs are the answer for everyone. I am super undisciplined. I'm disciplined in my writing. I don't set time aside for it. I think you were the person. It was either you or Lucy who told me to put my butt in the chair and write. I think it might have been you.
I've told people that before. Yes.
I think that came from you. So I really needed the structure and the deadlines. Like, I love a good deadline. I applied for my first grad school experience when I got an MBA with 29 seconds to spare. And I was like, oh, I'm early. My mom told me to stop calling her because she couldn't take it anymore. So I think that structure was super important. I do not have a background in English. I have a background in engineering and business. So it also forced me to just read widely. We were required to finish 60 books. I finished more than that because I had to write a long critical paper, which was our thesis, like our kind of academic thesis. So I really needed that structure. The bonus for me was that I met a group of people that I'm still in touch with, almost daily, some of them who I kind of write with and reflect with and talk about life with, and really kind of, they understand poetry the same way I do because we were taught by the same people. So it gives us a common language to talk about poetry with. So I know if I workshop with them, we're always going to structure the workshop the same way because we were taught to workshop by the same people. And I think that community is important. And the some MFA programs are a shortcut to that.
Yeah, right.
But I for sure don't think it's necessary by any means.
Yeah.
Unless you're a very lazy, undisciplined writer like me.
All right. There is a recurring theme in your in this collection. There are many recurring themes, but one I'm interested in talking about before we run out of time, which we soon will, is the idea that you are you're the only daughter of an only daughter. At one point, I think you say, you're the last leaf on the family tree, and you are in this collection are passing along stories that were passed along to you And you see yourself as the steward of these stories, for which there's nobody left to tell some of these stories. And you also talk about coming to terms with the idea that you're not going to have children. And so it's hard not to, an image that comes up implicitly and explicitly a time or two is that these poems, I don't want to be flippant and say these are your children, but these are your offspring. They are and they are doing what you're doing in this book, what people do, in terms of in families, keeping stories alive. And I'm going to read the last stanza of the last poem of your book. I would get you to do it, but I know you don't have a copy of the book with you. So, because you're not at home, you're in a hotel room.
It's true.
And so I'm going to read this to you. And I guess I should have said spoiler alert, because this is the end of the book. But I love this so much. You said, even because you're talking about being on a train, right?
Yeah, it starts on Alaska tundra. Yeah.
That's the last word. Yeah, you're in the Alaskan tundra. Even when I'm gone, leaving no one to trade my family stories, I will still be here in footprints and dust, in the lungs of the woman reading her book next to me on the train. I think that's a really, there's a lot of hope there. There's the habit of hope. So can you talk to me about that? I gave you a list of poems I wanted to talk about, and then I've talked about other poems. So I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right. I know my poetry.
Yeah.
So this poem was actually written over a bit of time. It wasn't written. I typically kind of gather all my images and write in one big. So I had already had the image. The poem begins with the image of us walking through the tundra of Alaska, and the guide told us, don't stand in one place too long, or the ground will basically take your footprint forever. So 500 years later, somebody walked through and your footprint's still there. So they didn't want us to leave those marks in the tundra. So that's the initial image. And then I was driving somewhere, and NPR was talking about how we slough our skin cells off. Like every 7 years, all of our skin cells have regenerated. And they just kind of float through the air as dust, which means we're breathing it in. It's landed on our tables.
Man, that's gross.
Something of it totally is gross, but something about those two images of the kind of world collecting us and our stories and our lives were too much to pass up. So I stuck them together in one poem, thinking about the things we leave behind and the ways we leave marks on the world when we don't even mean to. Yeah.
Yeah. And then sometimes we leave marks on the world on purpose, like this book.
Yes. I think this book, I don't have any children. I do have 15 godchildren. And I think part of this book was for them to have. They are almost all named in my acknowledgments, except for the one I think all of them are in there. So I think this is it's a gift to people who don't like poetry, but it's also a gift to them because they're now part of my story, even if they're not children I birthed. And I thought about them a lot as I wrote this and kind of what I wanted to leave for them.
Yeah. I love that idea of acknowledging the people for whom, you're giving something to them, but also they gave something to you by being people for you to give something to.
Yeah. I mean, I think as a writer, if I'm not thinking about who I'm writing for, my writing is going to be less generous. It's going to be tighter. It's not going to be. It's not going to be as hospitable. And I keep going back to that word because I'm passionate about hospitality and try to bring that into my life. But I really think my writing is part of that.
Yeah.
And I think if I'm thinking about the people I really want to be part of this space, and I write for them, then it's going to serve my poems better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, great. Well, I'm so glad that you've put these things together for those people and for the rest of us too. All right. I've been looking forward, because you've kind of already answered this question, but I'm going to let you keep answering it. Who are the writers that make you want to write?
Yes. Ada Limon, 100%.
Yep.
Natasha Trethewey was a former poet laureate out of Chicago. She writes a lot of books about her Southern upbringing, which heavily influenced my work. And Jeannie Murray Walker, I go back to all the time. Jeannie uses very clear language. She was really my invitation into poetry. Yeah. So if I get stuck, I go back to her. So I think those three poets in particular are people I go back to. There's a Jericho Brown book hanging out on my nightstand. I go back to him fairly frequently because of the way he looks at the world, and he is unashamed in the way he talks about hard things, and he does not back away from that. So there's some work in my book that's heavily influenced by him. So there's always poetry hanging around my house. Yeah. Stacked up on nightstands, by my bed, in my craft room, everywhere. Everywhere you can find it.
Yeah. Well, Dawn, thank you for being here. I love what you've done here in The Habit of Hope, and congratulations. And
thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.